Yeah, as Arseny kindly mentioned, I'm Nick Yonge. I'm a indie game developer and founder of a Vancouver-based game design company called Crane Games. I founded my company in December of 2010 and have been professionally making games since then. I spent the first few years of my company making online Flash web games and have been more recently making standalone titles for PC, Mac, and consoles. My more popular games like Nyan Cat Fly and I Saw Her Standing There have received tens of millions of plays online, being nominated for and won awards like the ArmorGames.com's Puzzle Game of the Year 2013, and several nominations and one finalist position in the Canadian Video Game Awards. Currently I'm working on a sci-fi game called Emerald, which you might have seen featured in the Indie Showcase here. So that's my professional history, but my actual experience during my early game dev years was a bit more visceral. I won't spend a lot of time talking about my story kind of thing in this talk, but I do want to give you a bit of background from my perspective. I founded my company in late 2010 and found early success through my Flash game Prior. That was sponsored and got me a few months' rent, but shortly after that the Flash game market started changing and drying up a bit. Most of the money was going to mobile and social games, and the Flash player platform started becoming much less of a dominant force in the casual games market. At times, money and funds for my company and for me absolutely got tight, though fortunately I had enough experience to contract myself out as a game design consultant or contract programmer at that point. Of course, I'd prefer to be working on my own stuff, but contracting certainly wasn't bad. But there weren't always contract positions available. There were times in my first few years as a professional game developer where I was broke as hell. They were hard situations and at times necessitating that I, as Arseny mentioned, pawn my furniture or electronics or other things of value just to be able to make food and rent, which, sucked. That said, though, I chose to be broke. I could have gotten a 9-to-5 job outside of the game design field. Not to say it's super easy to just get a job, but that's never an option that I pursued. Even in the most financially crushing and emotionally difficult of times, I preferred suffering for games rather than working a job that I wasn't passionate about. I always managed to pull through at the end, sometimes by selling an unexpected license to a game, or coming across some contract work for which I was suitably qualified. Sometimes, as mentioned, I had to pawn stuff, or in worst case scenarios, ask a friend or family member to borrow money. Those times were few and far between, fortunately, but undeniably the most difficult and full of the most self-doubt. Fortunately, those loans have all been paid back, and I'm in a stable place now, largely thanks to the games I created while under such financial duress. But after all is said and done, I did recover and prospered and now have a strong company making a few games funded via crowdfunding, media funds, finances made directly by my own company. And so, it's a better place now. And after those years of craziness, I had some time to be able to reflect and, think about, post-mortem, what went right, what went wrong, that sort of thing, and had a rather startling realization. I'm privileged as fuck to be broke. And totally missed that slide, but now we're on to this slide. So, what do I mean by that? There was a lot of luck involved in my success, sure, and I absolutely put in an earth-shattering amount of effort to get where I am today, and suffered for it. But all things considered, I was extremely privileged to begin with, notably in two major ways. First of all, I had a local support network. I had friends and family that could catch me if I really fell. Thankfully, I had to depend on that a precious few number of times. But had I not had that situation, things could have turned out much differently. Owing money, being evicted and homeless, or arrested if I accrued enough debt. I certainly would not be working in indie games, at any rate. Second, I'm a straight white cisgender male. And yes, this is one of those talks, and if that bothers you, then it's even more important that you kind of pay attention here. Despite being a web-based digital company, there were many, many times I had to sort out business matters in person. Things like getting a consultation on founding my company, applying for funding, networking events and conferences, scouting for contractors, all these things require some level of personal interaction. It's a sad truth that, statistically speaking, being anything other than a straight white male makes all of those things significantly more difficult. There were many times in my company's early years where a single no issued from some funding application reviewer based on an internal prejudice would have destroyed my company. That's not to mention the times I've had to meet people off Craigslist to sell things, or renting apartments from landlords and people who specified they'd rather not rent to single women or people of color, which is unfortunately a thing that still exists. It was shocking to realize how privileged I was to be able to sell my furniture. I'm not going to use the limited time of my talk to showcase the existence of these prejudices, but for any doubters, just spend 5 minutes on Google looking for any statistic whatsoever. Wage disparity, life expectancy, healthcare, victims of crime for minorities versus majorities, with the straight white male generally being the largest majority, and you'll find ample evidence showing that the majority gets an easier deal, and that's privilege. That's not to say I wouldn't have been successful if I had not been a white male kind of thing, but even though I didn't know it, I certainly had an enormous advantage by default. So what does this have to do with game design? The reason we're all here. As content creators, we shape our culture. Whether through its flash games or mobile casual games, social games or standalone titles, we make games that become part of the zeitgeist of our industry. Even in little casual games, we can reinforce ideas for better or for worse, so it's very important to be aware of what we're doing. I'm going to give you an example of how I accidentally reinforced sexism in our culture and how I used game design to help fix it. My most popular original IP is a game called I Saw Her Standing There. It's unrelated to the Beatles song, if any of you are aware of that by the same name. It's about a man who falls in love with a woman, but she's a zombie. It's also worth pointing out that if any of you are familiar with the movie Warm Bodies, which basically has the same plot, my game totally came out first. It's a cutesy little love story wrapped up in a puzzle platformer, a very indie title, but fantastically successful. It's received well over 10 million plays, and among other awards, it was a finalist in the Canadian Video Game Awards in 2013 for the Best Casual Games category. In it, you control a little stick figure dude who's in love with a pink stick figure woman who is a zombie. She tries to eat you, and you want to be with her because, love, but you also want to not die because death. So in every level, you trap her in a cage, only for her to escape from the cage and proceed to the next level. At the end of the game, she finally gets you, and you both become zombies and live happily ever after. The more astute of you here may have noticed something kind of problematic in that description. The literal goal of the game is to put your girlfriend into a cage. In the mythos of the game, it's because she's a zombie and she will straight up kill you if she is not held back, even though she loves you too. And you know she loves you because when she kills you, a little heart appears above her head, and when you die by other means, a broken heart appears. So there's that happy little connection. However, the metaphor is there, and my intent as a creator doesn't really matter. I realize that it's at best reinforcing sexism in games. At worst, it's a direct metaphor for an abusive relationship, forcing the player to play as the abuser. YouTubers had fun, making jokes like, get back in the cage, baby, and she deserves to be trapped, and yada yada. Watching these jokes made, repeated by other YouTubers and commenters was pretty nauseating. All told, it was still a lovely game with a positive ending about coming together despite differences in lifestyle, but the metaphor was there and the damage was done, and to this day it's an enormous source of guilt for me. So I decided to make a sequel and use game design to set things right. It's a remarkably simple solution. In the sequel called I Saw Her Across the World, gameplay is much the same, but with a more open world. The story continues from the old game, and both you and your lover are zombies now, playing a cross-continental game of tag, because apparently that's how zombies flirt. The story doesn't make a lot of sense, but video games, it's kind of silly. One main difference, though, is at the beginning of the game, you can simply choose your character's the color of their stick figure and their pronoun, as well as that of your lover. As well, the game's theme is no longer about making an incompatible relationship work, but about playing games together and working with each other. And with that, problem solved. From a game design perspective, the simple character customization screen vastly increases emotional investment and engagement on part of the user, and gets them mostly up to speed on the story. The text of the story changes to accommodate that choice. For example, I saw her standing there becomes I saw him standing there. Further legitimizing the player's choices. In the interest of inclusion, you can even set your pronoun to they and have non-gender binary characters for both you and your lover. And later levels in the game utilize the presence of both players working together to, as actual game mechanics. In other words, giving the player the ability to identify with the game in whatever way they choose is not simply an aesthetic thing, but actually strongly improves the experience overall. Thanks to the power of the internet comment, I know that it worked. I was expecting a pretty large internet backlash because, social agendas on the internet tend to come under a bit of fire, to put it lightly. And certainly some people were perturbed by the uncommon ability to create characters of any kind, like straight, gay, male, female, non-binary, whatever. But I was pleasantly surprised to find that many of the game's players and people who commented on it were completely in favor of having such inclusivity present in the game. Making a positive effort towards inclusivity is, not a lost cause. From a purely pragmatic perspective, I also know that many people shared my game with their friends specifically because of that feature. Using game design to address the issue of lack of minority representation in games works not only to make my game better and more popular, but help to address the issue of gender exclusion and sexism in games, a major problem and one that I unwittingly contributed to in earlier years. So to summarize, what does this have to do with games as a whole, and what does this have to do with you? So games are obviously a mainstream part of our culture, from big AAA titles to mobile social casual games to esoteric indie shit like I make. They're a vehicle for our cultural environment, and we as the creators are in the driver's seat. And that is a seat of privilege. We have a responsibility to ensure that we're making a positive impact on our culture as a whole. When we shirk that responsibility, we cause damage in the form of reinforcing negative stereotypes, alienating or hurting our audience, and tarnishing our own reputations. That's not to say that every game needs a socio-political agenda. Far from it. Games are more than welcome to just be games. They can be whatever you want them to be. They're games. But every developer, designer, consultant, or anyone with any kind of creative input on games should at least be aware of these kinds of issues that are plaguing our industry. I wasn't aware of them, and I, without knowing, created a game that encouraged sexism. I thought I was making a game about love, so it was kind of a shocking thing to realize. Once I educated myself a little more thoroughly and saw my mistake, I was able to use the privilege of being a creator with a known IP to create a game entirely about inclusivity and acceptance. I'm aware that this is a casual games audience that I'm speaking to right now, with an emphasis on statistics-driven design and virality, and that's all well and good. So, to repeat some hard facts once again, so to repeat some hard facts once again, by striving to make my game design more inclusive, I significantly increased my game's popularity. I Saw Her Standing There has received over 1 million plays in under a month, and thanks to comments and Twitter integration, I know that a significant amount of that is because of those inclusive efforts. People sharing this game because, look, you can actually be a non-binary character. We don't get that. Play this game. It just doesn't appear in the industry that much. It pays to be a positive force. So this is what I hope you take away from this talk. Educate yourselves on social issues in your medium, even if you don't think they affect you. Feminism and privilege are indeed excellent places to start, and a little Googling goes a long way. Use your privilege as someone with creative influence. You'll make games, and by extension, our entire culture, a big bunch more gooder. So, thank you very much. Any Q&A?
A question. I'll start. So, in your experience as a game designer, can you give some uncommon wisdom that you've come across?
Uncommon wisdom, like just sort of unintuitive.
Yeah, unintuitive, or something that's, you know, like some very famous person once said that the secret to making games is make sure they cost less than they make.
Yeah.
I don't think that's kind of, yeah. So
I guess that's pretty straightforward.
Did you run by anything interesting in your experience so far?
Yeah, I mean, you know, like in the aspect of my talk, I found like the more you strive to actually just be aware of other people and, you know, not ignore anybody, the more, you know, traction your game will get. It's, I guess, one more startling thing that I found is just how many audiences tend to pick up games. Like, you know, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but there's a lot of thought that the good old straight white male is the major demographic, but like, in my experience at least, that's very much not being the case, despite the fact that, you know, I come from a field of Flash games, and most Flash gamers are like kids in high school and, you know, teenagers who tend to have a bit of a reputation for being obnoxious. There's still, you know, it's you know, positivity and that sort of thing, and inclusion in games. I've just found the more I put it in, the better response it gets. Like, and it absolutely doesn't hurt to do so. So yeah.